All right, gang. Welcome aboard. Once again, it's time for the weekly Mac Forum video chat. You're tuned in to the April 30th edition. Wow, where is the year going? So let's go ahead and get right into it. Not quite sure how long the time will be tonight, but it's going to be roughly about a half an hour to cover everything. And kill the volume here. There we go. All right, so we don't get feedback from everything. There we go. Now, let's go ahead and get started. Our newest member is G. Shillman, and we have several new members that have joined this week, but that was the newest as of about a half an hour ago before the show started. So let's dive right on into the forum roundup and get an idea of what's going on this week. First of all, and I put this at the head of the list, uh, one of my fellow moderators, Razor Edge, pointed out that there is a new piece of malware that seems to be targeting Mac OS users. And essentially, what this is it uses a legitimate security certificate to get around Gatekeeper and some other features of Mac OS. And then once it's installed, the malware in question will monitor all network traffic and could basically suck up any data that it sees as useful. Okay, now how does this thing work? Well, I have a link in the thread. I have a link to the thread in the show notes, and the link is to the one of the original references. Essentially, what this is doing is it tells the user that they need to contact the IRS. That's the for those of you internationally, that would be contacting the Internal Revenue Service, which handles federal taxation issues here in the United States. And what it does is it sends you an email with a with a series of zip files attached, and the payload or the malware in question is inside those zip files. So when you click on the link and open those up, it then goes about setting itself up to infect your system. Now, the reason I refer to this and the reason everybody refers to this as malware is that unlike a true virus, it doesn't self-replicate. It has to essentially trick you via this phishing scam into triggering the payload, opening the files. So Razor has some good advice here in this portion of the thread. And it basically essentially says, I cannot stress this enough. Government agencies don't send you an email with random zip files about whatever it is that they claim to be responsible for. If you have an issue that they need to address with you, it's not going to come in the form of an email. I used to get these a few years ago with, at that time, they did not contain Mac specific payload, but it was emails that claimed to be from the FBI or claiming to be from some other government agency, claiming to have money that you were entitled to and needed to collect. All of these were designed basically to get your information and use it for other nefarious purposes. If you really think that this is legit, you make the contact with whatever that office is. Don't use the email address that's in the email. Don't use the phone number that may be in the email. Find a legitimate office number. You can find that in your local phone directory most of the time. And you make that contact and take some steps to make sure that the person you're talking to is legit before you do anything. Don't rely on the email address or the telephone number or anything like that that's in the email. And I have a link, as I say, I have a link to that thread in the show notes. And I'm also going to link back to something we discussed last week relative to avoiding these kinds of phishing scams. And here you can see this is a description, and a more detailed description of some of the payload that's involved and how it works. It's not incredibly complicated to understand. Even if you are a Mac novice, you'll probably get this article. It's very concise in the way it's written and gives you some pretty good information. All right, so let's move on. Let's see what else is going on in the forum. Apple working on a money transfer mechanism. Similar, I think, in ways to Apple Pay, but more closely related to Venmo and some of the other services that are available. Now, why are they going after something that's already being done? Well, we know Apple, they'll take a chance at doing something like this if they think they can do it better. Right now, the Apple Pay system and other things like it, it tends to be tied to the Apple ecosystem. In other words, Apple Pay works with your Apple Watch, works with your iPad, your iPhone. But some of these other services are a little more platform agnostic. You can send to users from another platform. So it's going to be interesting to see how this shakes out. I put a link in there again so you can kind of monitor this situation and see if it's something that you think you might be interested in. All right, now on to something a little more technical, but still pretty understandable. As the price of the solid state drives, or SSDs as you may see them referred to, come down, more and more people are moving away from the traditional spinning platter type hard drive onto solid state drives, which are essentially a chip that holds your data. And remember, Randy B. Singer has some interesting links for us about the reliability of these drives. Some theoretically, an SSD should be more reliable than a spinning platter hard drive. But there are some instances where they might not be. One of them being that some of the cheaper brands, for example, may not be. And some of the older models of SSDs do not necessarily play nice with Macs. So if you are looking at buying an SSD, this particular post from Randy has a wealth of information about some of the pitfalls and things that you need to be looking for. I can tell you from my own experience that an SSD can make a huge difference in certain aspects of your computer use. For example, my 2008 MacBook Pro had a spinning platter hard drive in it. And I shifted from that to an SSD a couple of years ago, about a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago. And that switch alone cut my boot time in roughly half. Okay, so this might be an interesting thread to look at, kind of look over the information, glean some insight into what you want to be looking for in the SSDs. I haven't made it through all of these articles yet, but I can tell you that the sites in question are pretty good about doing some very detailed testing on anything that they review. I've read some of their hard drive reviews in the past, particularly from places like Barefeets. So you might want to give those links a look if you are considering an SSD in the near future. As usual, Randy's got a lot of good information there. All right, moving right along, just so I can get things squared away here. We have an interesting thread from a member wanting to know about charging iPads in particular, and why it was that with their iPad 2 with the latest OS, it would not charge it doesn't show as charging when it is switched on. So in other words, if the iPad is on, it doesn't show as charging. If the iPad is off, then it will show as charging. And they were curious as to why. And one of our forum moderators reminded everyone in the thread about this. One of the problems, particularly with older Macs, is that the USB ports just do not provide enough juice to that iPad to have it simultaneously charge and be being used at the same time. Okay? Essentially, what you have a lot of times is, as long as it's off, it'll charge, in some cases a little bit slowly. And then the minute you turn it on, you see the not charging symbol. The solutions for these, one, don't try to do both if it's plugged into your Mac. And two, the reason I link to this thread is how big an issue this is for you will depend on which particular iPad you have and also which Mac, because some of the newer machines have USB ports that put out a little bit more power. So with the right combination of hardware, you may not have this problem. It's not a huge issue because, as I say, when it's off, it does charge. So that would be something to look at. Rad Dave, king of the screenshots, has some information in there too as well that might be helpful. And you'll find some of those links. There are a couple of links in the thread that give you some references to where the information comes from. All right, and also, I put this one in, this link. Here's another iPad-related question. Because I put this in because for as long as I've been using iPads, I had not really thought to do this. When I got my iPad, my original iPad, I bought one of the first generation ones. I was one of those brave souls that plunked down a ton of money and got them almost as soon as they were announced. I had to wait a little while to get the one that had cellular and Wi-Fi, but I've had an iPad since the beginning. And I am it's sort of annoying me that I did not think to do this, okay? I should have thought of this and I didn't, and it really just annoys me, but it's actually interesting. The member in question wanted to know, apparently the iPad is not going to arrive for a few more days, but there are a couple of pieces of software, a couple of applications that he would like to get that are free right now, but will not be free when he gets the iPad. It's a this limited time deal. And essentially the question is, can I get this software now, even though I don't have the iPad yet, and get it while it's still free? Well, the answer is yes, you can. Usually this will work. What you would do then is to go ahead, load up iTunes and open the iTunes store and make sure that you've signed in with a user account and go ahead and complete the purchase. Now, a free thing is going to show up with the warning that says you're about to purchase this software. Okay, it does that no matter what, whether it's free or whether it has a price. So just make sure you check the label right by the program. It will tell you whether it's free or what the price is. Because you've logged into the iTunes store from your Mac, it will download that file to your Mac. And then later, when you actually get your iOS device, your iPhone, your iPad, you can then sync the iPhone and iPad and have the software downloaded to the iPad. It's important, if you're going to do that, it's important, obviously, that you do it from the Mac, because obviously, since you don't have the iOS device yet, you can't do it using the iOS device. You have to do it from the Mac. And it's usually a good idea too, because of some recent changes that have been made in the iTunes store. If you have a bunch of updates that you need to download those to your Mac and then sync the ones that you want to add to your iOS device. What happens is, if you do it the other way around, here's what happens. Let's say that I download something on my iOS device. When I sync, it doesn't automatically move the most recent app into my library. So I may run into a situation where I have an older version of the app in my iTunes library, a newer version of the app on the device. Well, now if I need to make any changes or reload from backup or anything, it's going to contain the older version of the device, so of the software rather. So what you want to do, if you're going to do this little trick, and this, as I say, this is something that that I had not thought of doing. This should work if you just go ahead and download your software that you want to get. When you get the iPad, you go ahead and do the setup procedure just like you are instructed to. Follow the setup instructions. Once you've gotten it set up, then you can sync with iTunes, and that will get you get everything squared away so that you have the newer information and you have those free apps that you wanted to get. And I do encourage you to take a real good look. If you are a new iOS device user, take a really good look at the iOS App Store periodically. There's a lot of good software there, and some of it is free. There's quite a bit of it that, although it isn't free, has a good description of what it does. So you can download it, run it in limited mode where some of the features work and some of them don't, and then pay for it, if you decide that it's okay and you want it. There's other software in there that follows a kind of an in-app purchase mode. You see that a lot with some of the games, some of the Tetris games and Bejeweled and similar type games, where to get some of the boosts and other things that are available, you qualify. What you do is you download the app, you install it, you start playing it, and then you make in-app purchases for these other things. All right, that's going to do it for that little iOS tidbit. And before I leave that, I do want to mention two parents, okay? Specifically as it applies to in-app purchases. You can set the security settings on your account in such a way that before a purchase is made, someone has to provide the password for your Apple ID account for the iTunes store. And that's a good thing to do. I know it's a pain having to enter the password when you make a purchase, but the good advantage of doing that is that it makes it much more difficult if, say, for example, your son or daughter is using your iPad and they won't be able to accidentally make in-app purchases and run up big bills. That has happened on occasion before. The best way around that is to go into those security settings, tell the iTunes store that you want to have to enter your ID and your password. That way, unless your child knows your password, they're not going to be able to make these in-app purchases without getting your permission first. All right, speaking of iTunes and iTunes on the iOS devices, if you've been a regular listener of the show, you know that I've mentioned on a couple of different occasions that I personally would like to see iTunes rewritten from the ground up, just start from scratch. And my reasoning for it is uh, if you have a large collection, a large music collection, iTunes can sometimes kind of start to bog down a little bit as you launch it, as you interact with it. And it's because the original iTunes worked pretty much as a music player. I mean, that's how you, and it synced iPods. Almost said iPads, but iTunes predates the iPad. You could use the iTunes program to rip your CDs, pull them into the computer, to play back music, and to sync music between your computer and your uh, iPod. Well, over the years, iTunes has grown into branched out where it now plays movies. It manages apps for the iOS devices. It handles uh, some conversion, music conversion, say where you're going to convert a piece of music from one type of file to another. It handles applications for iOS devices, syncing with iOS devices. All of these things got rolled into iTunes. And it seems like every time there's a new update to iTunes, something breaks. And if you've got an older system, iTunes will certainly bog down from time to time, depending on how large your collection is. And I've mentioned over at the Kirk McLaren's Kirkville site that I thought iTunes should be split into a couple of different programs. One that managed the administrative side, tagging songs, tagging music, tagging movies, and syncing it with your various devices. And then the other side of it would handle just the playback. Uh, and Kirk disagrees with me. He read my post and he gave some pretty good ideas about why he disagreed and thought that what I was proposing would be a little more cumbersome. And he's probably right. But on his site right now, he gives you a real good explanation of why he thinks that would not work. Okay, and it essentially boils down to it makes sense to run one application at a time or one function at a time on iOS devices, and that we don't use the computer version of iTunes the same way. And I put that in there because it's an interesting read. And I have to say, his logic is good about why you don't want them as separate apps. Uh, that means I'm back to square one. I still think iTunes need to be redone. I'm just not sure how to go about doing it. He did a pretty good job of explaining. And no, he didn't target that specifically at me. I don't know Kurt personally. This is because he probably wrote this because this is something that comes up periodically when people get frustrated with iTunes. So it's an interesting read, and it's something that will probably help you to understand why iTunes behaves the way it does. All right. And not to leave iTunes behind this evening, here's something else. And I had not thought of this as a potential issue, but I do want to mention it. At the bottom of any of the articles on Kirk's Kirkville site, he has links to related articles. And when I read the previous article about what to do with iTunes, I saw this link about not using WAV files. Why you want to avoid using WAV files. Now, being a Mac user and trying to touch a PC as little as possible, I don't have a lot of music in WAV format. I do have a few tunes that are in AIF, which is an uncompressed format. Now, this little article gives you a real good example. of why you want to avoid WAV files without uh, going into excruciating detail and boring you to death. Essentially, what's happening is this. People a lot of times would use WAV files because they're uncompressed. It's basically the raw audio file, like what you would get if you copied over a CD. And that's great, except for one tiny little thing. Now, obviously, you're thinking in terms of the space. Every CD would take up somewhere roughly on the order of 700 megabyte, which could get a little hairy if you have a large music collection. But that's not the problem, and it's not the reason that Kirk suggests not using WAV as your format. What happens with a WAV file is this. Let's say you pull the file into iTunes and you add all the tagging information, okay? The tags are there as long as you have that file in your iTunes library. But if there's any kind of a hiccup or any kind of a change at all, the tags are not saved inside the audio file. WAV files don't have a method of supporting that for the most part. Now, there may be some tricks around it on the PC side, but essentially, what happens is if you ever have to interact with those files, pull them out of iTunes and then put them in again later, you're going to have to go back and redo all of that tagging. Now, what does he suggest using? Well, I'm going to quote this next little statement. It says, if you want the best quality in iTunes, use Apple's lossless format, unquote. And these are compressed files, but they don't lose. They use a form of lossless compression. I know that some people claim to be able to tell the difference between lossless and WAV files, between these compressed files, these Apple lossless files, and WAV files. I can tell you that for the stuff I use, that I listen to on my equipment, I can't tell the difference. Okay, so I've got a lot of my music in lossless format. I've only got a handful of stuff in AIF format, and probably will change that over to something else to preserve the tagging in it. A lot of my stuff is AAC format because that's what was used in the iTunes store. So I put that there for those of you that are kind of thinking about what to do with large music collections and what you want to do in terms of file format. Because let's face it, ripping a bunch of music is a time-consuming process. And you don't want to have to do this. You don't want to do it in one format and then go back later and say, oh my gosh, I wish I had picked a different format. It's not compatible. It doesn't this, it doesn't that. So I'll link to that article. And as you'll notice at the bottom of that article, there is one on the basics of lossless music files, along with a few other tidbits of information about converting sound files from one format to another. And it's a good thing to have in your little arsenal. Kirk's material is usually written in a way that's very easy to understand. He obviously knows his stuff and can explain it without getting too bogged down in the details usually. So even if you're not a techie, these articles are good to use and have at least have a look at and decide how you want to manage your growing collection of media. And that really covers what I had on the agenda for tonight. I didn't pull anything as far as a specific Mac OS tip. I'll give you an idea of what I'm working on, and it probably will appear next week. I want to, as part of our series on things that are underused in the operating system, I want to take a look at the accessibility features, uh, both in terms of using them for folks with disabilities, but also in terms of how they may be able to benefit someone who doesn't have an actual disability, but they want to get around some quirks of the operating system. I know, for example, that I know a number of users who, although they don't have significant vision issues, because they're a little bit older, they've done things like make the mouse pointer a little bit bigger so that it's easier to see. And as you can see from mine, if I can get it back on screen here, I have mine just a little bit bigger than it normally is, not much. You can certainly make it much bigger, but I don't need it quite that large. There are a number of other features in there that, although they are in there to assist folks with disabilities, they can also be helpful if you don't have a disability. I'll give you another example from the iPhone. I've gone into iPhone settings and changed the text to make it bolder than it normally appears. I just find that a little bit easier to read. Now, I do have some vision issues, but I find that some of the accessibility features are helpful to me, some of them aren't. So one of the things I like about the way Apple has approached it is you don't have to have it on if you don't need it. And you can kind of pick and choose which features you might find useful. So I'm going to spend some time talking about that probably next week, both in terms of how it might help folks that need it for accessibility purposes, and why you might want to turn it on to help with some other issues. As I say, I've got some features turned on, some of them I don't. So we'll go through some of those sometime in the coming weeks, and we'll take a look at that and see how everything shakes out. And as the weeks go forward, I'm going to add more and more things, from little quirks about the macOS or iOS that we don't use very often, but might be useful to know a little bit more about. All right, guys, that's going to do it for this week's show. Real kind of short, sweet, and to the point. I hope that you find the information that I included this week useful. We'll try to add a few more tips and tricks next week, when maybe I'll have a little more time to delve into them and put them together in a coherent fashion. And until next week, this has been your host, Sylvester Rock, aka Sly Dude on the forum. No, I didn't do any stupid computer mistakes this week. I survived the week without any major screw-ups on the computer, so you don't get to laugh at my expense this week, okay? You got to wait another week or two for that. I'm sure there will be one. I just don't know when it is. But I hope that you've enjoyed this week's show, and until next time, I'll see you in the forum.